Few characters in Bloodborne loom larger and prove more consequential than Laurence. He's a transformative figure in Yharnam's history, and it's the mystique of his character that makes him so intriguing. He speaks only 5 lines of dialogue, and we never see him alive, yet we experience his legacy at almost every stage of the game. That's probably why the more we learn about Laurence, the more we can demystify Bloodborne's lore. And that's precisely why I dedicated a lengthy episode in December 2022 to this very effort, titled What Really Happened to Laurence. The video challenged some of the most long-held beliefs about the game's story, which caused some confusion and a good bit of disagreement. But there's much more to Laurence's story than we could address in one session. In this episode, we'll continue uncovering hidden pieces of Laurence's past, including his role in the establishment of the Healing Church and his life after death, so to speak. We'll clarify a few points from the previous video that left some viewers unsatisfied and unmoved. And we'll correct a mistaken conclusion about the identity of the scholarly figure presiding over the Surgery Altar. My sense is that for us to determine who this person is, we just need to know who this person is. I'm convinced we already know the answer to that. And there's a collection of details I missed before that might blow the lid off the mystery about what really happened to Laurence. If you watched my previous video about Laurence, you already know my thoughts about the identity of the body on the Surgery Altar. It's incredibly hard to see how this could be anyone other than Laurence. The evidence is just so compelling. Understandably, there was some skepticism around this idea, so let's explore it much more thoroughly. The key to identifying this body lies in the interconnection between Bloodborne's 3 cathedrals, which include 2 cathedrals in the Hunter's Nightmare and the Grand Cathedral in the Waking World. Within these 3 cathedrals, we find 4 distinct altars, and the tiny details within these 4 spaces make a monumental impact on Bloodborne's story. Although they vary in their designs, the altars we find in the Waking and Nightmare worlds have one main feature in common. Upon each altar, we find something representing the bodily remains of Laurence. Let's examine. In the Waking World Grand Cathedral, we have an altar upon which rests the beastly skull of Laurence. We're shown that these are his actual physical remains, because touching the skull allows us to somehow access his memories. So, Laurence's bodily remains are found on an altar in this cathedral in the Waking World. As we know, there are 2 Grand Cathedrals in the Hunter's Nightmare. In the first of these Grand Cathedrals, we find another altar, this one displaying the lifeless cleric beast body of Laurence. This is a nightmarish and highly stylized depiction of his remains. Here, as before, we have an altar in a cathedral upon which we find a depiction of the bodily remains of Laurence. Within the second Grand Cathedral in the Hunter's Nightmare, we find the Surgery Altar. Yet again, we're in a cathedral that contains an altar, specifically the Surgery Altar, where we find yet another set of bodily remains. We don't yet know the identity of this body, but there seems to be a pattern emerging here. What we discover is that everything we can do or observe in this space, the Surgery Altar, yields clues that connect this body to Laurence. As I detailed in What Really Happened to Laurence, if we want to unlock the Surgery Altar elevator, we do that by going to the other Grand Cathedral in the Nightmare, this one containing the cleric beast body of Laurence, where we pick up the item called the eye pendant from Laurence's hand. We then take it to the other Grand Cathedral, where we place it into the skull of the dissected body on the Surgery Altar. This directly links Laurence, in his cleric beast form, to the dissected body on the altar. When we then use the Surgery Altar elevator to raise the platform, directly below the Surgery Altar, we find our 4th and final altar. It's here we're able to obtain the item called Laurence's Skull, yet another reference to Laurence's bodily remains. Everything about these altars in the Nightmare Cathedrals and in the Waking World Grand Cathedral relates to the bodily remains of Laurence. His beastly skull, his human skull that no longer exists in reality, and his dead cleric beast body, or at least a nightmarish depiction of it. If all the altars in the cathedrals are showcasing a version of Lawrence's bodily remains, it's very hard to see how the Surgery Altar is doing anything different. It's showing us Lawrence's dissected human body. This pattern is certainly persuasive, but it's the clues we receive later that prove much more convincing. After we retrieve the item Lawrence's skull, we can take it back to the other Nightmare Cathedral, where we essentially resurrect Lawrence simply by bringing him his human skull. Lawrence returns to life and immediately closes his hand that was holding the eye pendant, as if he realizes that it's missing or has been used for something. It was because we placed it in the skull of the dissected body on the Surgery Altar. That's when Lawrence reaches up and places his other hand on the top of his head, the same place where the dissected body is missing the top of its skull. But what's more, later in the boss fight, Lawrence's legs suddenly and rather inexplicably explode, and he spends the rest of the fight crawling around on the floor. Why? It's because the dissected body on the Surgery Altar is missing its legs. The physical reactions of Lawrence, the first vicar, are a direct reflection of the physical features of the dissected body on the Surgery Altar. These aren't the only parallels here. As we just observed, the altar of the Waking World Grand Cathedral looks almost identical to the lower level of the Surgery Altar. That doesn't seem particularly important on its own, but we absolutely cannot dismiss the design of this area. It was almost certainly designed not to be a duplicate or a copy, but a sort of reflection or inverse. On the Waking World altar, we find the beastly skull of Lawrence. Not his whole body, just his beastly skull. In the Nightmare version of this altar, we find what's essentially the opposite. We find the item Lawrence's skull, which is a depiction of his human skull. The altar doesn't contain his whole body, just his human skull. So, one altar has a beast version of his skull, one has a human version. In this regard, the altars are two sides of the same coin. Let's apply this same rationale to the two remaining altars. In the other Nightmare Cathedral, we have Lawrence's cleric beast body. Not just his skull, but his whole outstretched beastly body. If the same rules apply to these two altars as they did with the altars containing Lawrence's skulls, what should we expect to see on the fourth altar? We should find some version of Lawrence's outstretched human remains. On the Surgery Altar, what do we have? We have what appears to be Lawrence's human body. Not just his skull, but his outstretched human body. These altars are two sides of the same coin. There's more evidence that supports this concept, which we'll come back to in a bit, but there's still more to discuss. It's well known that the cleric beast body of Lawrence is posed similarly to Christ in Michelangelo's La Pietà, which gives a divine aura to his corpse and helps to cast Lawrence as a Christ-like figure. As I've mentioned in other videos, there's no Mary figure here in this display. It's just Lawrence. But he's lying on top of abundant drapery that recalls the cascading cloth of Mary's dress within Michelangelo's sculpture. Why is this relevant? Well, what do we see on the Surgery Altar? Quite similarly, we see a corpse lying upon abundant drapery that extends in rippled sheets down to the floor. This equation of Lawrence with a cadaver is why I've repeatedly argued that Lawrence is actually positioned to look like the plaster cast of a dissected body called From Nature, made by Scottish anatomist John Goodsir in 1845, which itself was an anatomical homage to La Pietà. We have an actual cadaver on this altar, and we have a cleric beast posed like Goodsir's cadaver on the other altar. So to summarize, we have the following connections between the Surgery Altar containing the dissected body and the Nightmare Grand Cathedral altar containing Lawrence's cleric beast body. Lawrence holds the eye pendant in his left hand. He's lying atop an altar covered in bountiful drapery. We take the eye pendant from Lawrence and put it in the skull of the cadaver on the Surgery Altar, which is also lying on top of bountiful drapery. The cadaver is missing its legs, and Lawrence's legs explode during his boss fight. The cadaver is missing the top of its skull, which is where Laurence places his hand during his boss fight cutscene. On one altar, we have a cadaver. On the other altar, we have a cleric beast posed in a position identical to that of a cadaver from a work of Victorian medical art. Finally, there are 4 total altars in the game's 3 grand cathedrals. 2 nearly identical altars contain the beast skull and the human skull of Laurence. The other 2 altars contain outstretched dead bodies, one of a beastly version of Laurence, the other of a human. If the logic of the altars applies here, this should be Laurence's human body. We know Laurence is a transformative figure in the development of the Healing Church, considering his skull is a holy relic held within the apse of the church's grand cathedral. It's interesting then that the Surgery Altar in the Hunter's Nightmare would be found in the same position within the apse of this cathedral. Given the prominence of the Surgery Altar, its placement within a cathedral, and its unique design, we can assume it's a place of great importance within the history of the Healing Church. This seems even more reasonable given the item description of the eye pendant, which unlocks the Surgery Altar elevator. The elevator takes us to the Research Hall, a private place accessible to only chosen members of the Healing Church. All of these elements, when taken together, help us draw our first major conclusion from this episode. The cadaver on the Surgery Altar is the human body of Laurence, and the scene depicted here is a snapshot of a pivotal moment in the history of the Healing Church. This conclusion will seem even more accurate once we reach the end of this video. As I mentioned at the end of the previous Laurence video, the cathedral containing the Surgery Altar seems to show us the saga of Laurence in 3 acts. And I believe we're shown 2 depictions of Laurence's dead body in this cathedral, one shortly after his death, and one after his body had been dissected. Let's take a closer look at this idea. If we take the Surgery Altar elevator from the base of the research hall down to the cathedral's main floor, what do you see? It's impossible not to notice the bright light flooding the Surgery Altar, almost like the table is being lit up for a surgical procedure. It's so striking, in fact, that I wondered if there were other features in the cathedral that are illuminated in the same way. As we move toward the other end of the cathedral, we see light streaming into the church from the upper windows, but it's mostly shining onto the floor, which doesn't contain anything other than the same mandala pattern we see throughout each of the 3 grand cathedrals. But the light is also shining directly onto the face of the dead body shown in this effigy tomb. So on one end of the cathedral, we have an effigy tomb depicting a recently deceased person wrapped in a death shroud, and on the other end, we have a cadaver on a surgery altar. The lighting is a link between them. It's also worth noting that in terms of lighting, we don't observe anything remotely similar in the other 2 cathedrals in the game. There's a little bit of moonlight shining into the Waking World Grand Cathedral, which illuminates the floor on one side. The Nightmare Grand Cathedral, though, doesn't have any major light source, and only the altar is slightly illuminated, but nowhere near the extent we see in the Surgery Altar Cathedral. The lighting here is unique, it's incredibly noticeable, and therefore it was almost certainly designed this way with intent. I think it's to help us connect these 2 corpses. The design of these 2 monuments also seems to be very intentional, with real-world associations. Tomb effigies have been a form of funerary art for thousands of years, but so-called recumbent effigies, which display a deceased person lying on their back on a stone slab, became more established in Europe and Great Britain in the 11th century and continued to increase in their intricacy over the next several hundred years. These early effigies were carved for the tombs of royalty, typically capturing the deceased in a regal and flattering light and showing them as youthful and lavishly dressed. That's not what we observe with the sculptures in this cathedral, which display unadorned dead bodies at 2 points after death. That's why I think the Surgery Altar and the effigy monument on the other end of the cathedral appear to be inspired stylistically by what are known as Transi, or cadaver monuments. Popular among the landed elite and the high clergy of the 14th to 16th centuries, cadaver monuments emphasized human mortality, in stark contrast to the traditional gisant monuments of earlier centuries that we just discussed. which captured the deceased as they were in life, typically adorned in formal regalia to signify their status. Although a subset of cadaver monuments called verminous cadaver monuments showed the corpse having been eaten away by worms or other creatures, most cadaver monuments, especially those of Great Britain, displayed the dead not as decayed corpses, but instead as emaciated bodies still containing their outer flesh, with their abdomens either degraded or completely eviscerated, meaning the internal organs of the abdomen or viscera were removed. Believed to be the first cadaver monument produced in Great Britain, the tomb of Archbishop Henry Chichely was completed around 1425. Just like Bloodborne's cadavers on or near the surgery altar, Chichely's tomb is found within a cathedral, specifically the Canterbury Cathedral in southeast England. This is the case for the majority of Britain's 44 known cadaver monuments, which are mostly contained in cathedrals or abbeys and were made for senior clerics of the Roman Catholic Church. Chichely's tomb is a so-called double-decker style, with the top effigy showing the archbishop as he was in life, dressed in full church attire. Below, however, is a sculpture depicting his recently deceased body, lacking all adornment except for his burial shroud. The burial shroud is a common feature of cadaver monuments, often lying beneath the body or sometimes partially draping the deceased to preserve their modesty. The body in the tomb effigy, as with most real-life cadaver monuments, is draped in a death shroud. This sculpture also is found in a cathedral whose design is highly influenced by the Roman Catholic Church, just as with the Transi sculptures. And because of its design style and the fact that it's brightly illuminated like the surgery altar, I really don't think this effigy is a cast-off environmental asset, even though we do find this exact same asset elsewhere in the game. Call it a scavenger hunt. You can let me know in the comments if you know where else this asset can be found and what you think it means in that context. If the moonlit corpses in the cathedral are showing us the same person, and if it's Laurence, this leads us to the second conclusion of this episode. The surgery altar and tomb effigy show that Laurence died as a man, not a beast, and was later dissected as a man, not a beast. If this is true, it's an earth-shattering revelation about Bloodborne's plot. It also leaves us to wonder how we end up with Laurence's beastly skull in the Waking World Grand Cathedral. I think there are several possible explanations, which we'll explore in the next episode. But before we can get there, we need to finish our examination of the surgery altar. There's much more here for us to dig through. I stand behind everything I said in what really happened to Laurence, with one major exception. My mistake was thinking that the main scholarly figure shown in the surgery altar display is Willem, specifically a younger version of Willem. I got this flat out wrong. But why did I think that this is Willem? I went into much greater depth about my rationale in that previous video about Laurence, but the short version is that there are some details in the item descriptions of the Graveguard attire set, especially in the original Japanese, that indicate Willem might have been involved in the removal of a body from the labyrinth, also known as the Tomb of the Gods. If Willem and two of his servants did indeed remove a body from a tomb, most likely accessing it through the forbidden grave outside Byrgenwerth, it's not entirely unreasonable to think that the surgery altar is showing us Willem and his two servants dissecting that same body. I was also persuaded by one visual element in particular. The surgeon in the sculpture is wearing a tall papal or bishop's mitre, which is very similar to the one that Willem is wearing when we find him on the balcony overlooking the Moonside Lake. It also contains a blinder over the eyes, just like Willem's hat does. The problem with this idea, at least from a visual standpoint, is that if this were a depiction of a young Willem, the evidence just doesn't line up. In the Byrgenwerth cutscene showing the discussion between Laurence and Willem doesn't look anything like the figure leading the dissection ritual on the surgery altar. Willem looks like an old, decrepit man with a hairless face, but not at all like the slender, bearded man we see in the surgery altar sculpture. It just doesn't make sense that this would be a young Willem dissecting Laurence's body, because Willem was already old when Laurence was still alive. That's why I got this wrong. But it got me wondering, is this bearded figure supposed to be a named character in the game, or is it just some generic scholar from Bergenworth or maybe the early Healing Church? If it is just some random person, why didn't From Software just make him a third nondescript hooded figure? Why give him such specific features and clothing? To answer those questions, I tried to work backwards. If we know that this is Laurence, who would be responsible for dissecting his body? The clues point to one person, if we're willing to examine this from a completely new perspective. Just a short walk from the Surgery Altar is the underground prison housing our friend, Brador. And strange as it might seem at first, there are several notable details we can observe about or infer from Brador that open the door to the possibility that he might be the person depicted leading the Surgery Altar dissection. And yes, I'm using the term dissection even though this scene seems to show some sort of ritual. As I've repeatedly argued in my videos, Bloodborne's rituals are code for anatomical dissection. This location is one of the best pieces of evidence to support that argument. In terms of Brador, let's start with a couple of surface-level observations and then build our way into the strongest findings. Just like the figure in the sculpture, Brador has a beard. That might not seem like a very convincing detail on its own, I acknowledge, but it could be more than just a random design choice. If this person in the sculpture is indeed a named character from the game, there are very few who match this design. We have 26 NPCs in Bloodborne with whom we can interact. 16 of these 26 NPCs are men. 2 of these 16 men we never see in human form. That's Ludwig and Gilbert. We're left then with 14 male characters who have a human or human-like appearance that we can actually observe in-game or through data mined files. Of those 14, Brador is one of only 3 who has a full beard and mustache that would match the facial hair in the sculpture. The other 2 are the Blood Minister and Simon the Herod, but there's really not much that would suggest the surgeon in the altar is either of these 2 characters. But that's not the case with Brador. Environmental features provide a ton of information in Bloodborne, and I don't think we can overlook the mere proximity of Brador and the Surgery Altar. Brador can be found in a cell less than a few hundred steps away in what's essentially an adjacent hallway. Moreover, the tomb effigy showing what appears to be Laurence's recently deceased human body is almost exactly halfway between Brador and the Surgery Altar. The beard and the proximity are the shallowest observations we can make. But it's once we get into the subtleties of Brador's attire that we start making major headway. Brador wears 2 important items, the beast-hide garb and the headwear called Brador's Testimony. The descriptions of these 2 attire pieces tell us that they're the scalp and the hide of a horrible cleric beast. Brador's Testimony specifically says he killed a compatriot and then wore his ally's own scalp. For years, many players, myself included, have presumed that the compatriot mentioned in Brador's attire set was Laurence. That belief largely rests on 2 supporting factors. First, we know that Brador killed a cleric beast based on the item descriptions in his attire set. Second, we know from the item Laurence's skull that, in reality, Laurence became the first cleric beast. And of course, the boss titled Laurence the First Vicar appears in the form of a giant cleric beast. So we know that Laurence became a cleric beast and Brador killed one. That's the bulk of the hard evidence linking the 2. Beyond that, we've kind of had to rely on some less conspicuous details and a little bit of story crafting to try and make this work. But because we as a lore community had really yet to consider, let alone conclude, that the cadaver on the Surgery Altar is Laurence, we've missed what could be several valuable pieces of evidence that bolster the theory linking Brador with Laurence. Let me show you. According to Brador's attire set, Brador scalped a cleric beast and then wore the scalp. We can see this quite literally in the design of Brador's Testimony. He also skinned this cleric beast and wore its hide. But let's think about this literally. What does this mean? It means Brador used a sharp object of some sort to remove the flesh from both the top of the head and the torso of this cleric beast. Why does this matter? Well, let's look again at the body on the surgery altar. What do we see? This body isn't a skeleton. There are still huge chunks of flesh around the pelvis and inside the ribcage. This is a cadaver on a surgery altar being manipulated by figures wearing surgical long gloves. This is a dissected body, and the flesh of the torso is missing. It's not just that it's all rotted away, it's been removed. This cadaver was skinned, just like Brador's compatriot. But much more importantly, it's missing the top of its skull. And not just as if it's been bashed in with a blunt object. It has a circular incision, as if the cranium was removed with a sharp object. It's been scalped, so to speak. This leads us to the third major conclusion of this episode. If the body on the table is Lawrence's body, and it's been skinned and scalped, just like what Brador did to a cleric beast, it seems much more plausible that the cleric beast Brador skinned and scalped was Laurence. I know what you're thinking. Brador's wearing the scalp and hide of a beast. How is this possible if he actually just dissected a human body? As with many aspects of Bloodborne, we're receiving a heavy dose of symbolism here. We'll return to this question soon, but for now, let's focus on what else we can observe about Brador. Earlier in this video, we saw how the surgery altar and the nightmare altar showing Lawrence's cleric beast body are two sides of the same coin. One shows Lawrence's recumbent beastly body, while the other shows his recumbent human body. But there's something a little less obvious here. The Nightmare Grand Cathedral contains an altar that's a mirror image of the altar we observe in the Waking World Grand Cathedral. Let's take a look first at the Waking World. Above the altar, there's a headless statue of some divine figure pouring what we could presume is blood from a holy vessel. It appears to be a feminine figure with a beast hide or fleece laid over her shoulder. The vessel and the beast hide are shown on her right side. Now, let's look at the Nightmare Grand Cathedral. Here, that same figure is facing the opposite way, pouring blood out of a vessel on her left side, with the fleece draped over her left shoulder. It's not immediately clear why this figure was reversed, and it's easy to simply assume this was done by the designers as a means of contrasting the waking world and nightmare versions of the altars. But that explanation doesn't seem to hold up, considering the lower level of the surgery altar, which we also find in the nightmare, is essentially identical to the waking world altar. The divine figures are facing the same direction. This indicates that From Software flipped the statue in the Nightmare Grand Cathedral for a reason, and I'm pretty sure they did. Why? Well, let's ask ourselves, what else in this space is reversed when compared with what we find in the other cathedrals? This is a difficult question to answer, especially given that each altar is almost perfectly symmetrical, but there is most definitely something else that's flipped. The key to unlocking this mystery lies in the visual details of Brador's attire, meaning the actual beast scalp that Brador's wearing when we encounter him in his cell. Just like the bosses Laurence and the cleric beast, the scalp that Brador is wearing contains antlers. But unlike the cleric beast boss, whose design shows two fully formed antlers, one of the antlers on Brador's scalp is broken. Notice that this isn't applicable to the design of Brador's testimony or to the scalp that Brador is seen wearing when he invades us elsewhere in the nightmare. It's only the case for the Brador we find in his cell, or what we could consider the actual Brador. Note that the broken antler is on Brador's right side. If we look closely now at Laurence, the first vicar within the Nightmare Grand Cathedral, we see the same feature. There's one antler that's broken off. But unlike the broken antler on the scalp that Brador is wearing, Laurence's broken antler is on his left side. These two beast scalps match. It's just that Laurence's scalp design was reversed, just like the divine figure in the Nightmare Grand Cathedral, the same place we find Laurence. The figure above Laurence's cleric beast body likely was flipped simply for this purpose, to provide the necessary point of reference that things in this cathedral might be backwards, so that we could confirm that Brador's scalp is Laurence's scalp. What are we supposed to take away from all the textual and atmospheric details we've uncovered? If we know that the cadaver is Laurence, and we know that Brador skinned and scalped Laurence, we can conclude that the man leading the dissection ritual on the surgery altar is Brador. What does this all mean? It means that the game is giving us two stories and leaving it up to us to determine which one is true, or more likely, which one we should take literally and which one we should take figuratively. The item descriptions tell us a story of Brador, a healing church assassin who killed, skinned, and scalped a compatriot who had transformed into a horrible cleric beast, presumably Laurence. By contrast, the environmental features are telling us a parallel story, one that could either be interpreted literally or metaphorically. Brador was a scholar or surgeon who dissected Laurence's human body, removing the flesh of his torso, removing his cranium, and quite possibly cutting off his legs in the name of research. His clothes were covered in Laurence's blood and flesh from dissecting his dead body. Back to our question. Brador is shown wearing a cleric beast scalp and hide. If, in reality, he was a scholar who dissected Laurence's dead human body, then why is he wearing attire that looks like an actual cleric beast? How do we reconcile this? I think it's very fair to say that the nightmare is feeding us heaping doses of symbolism, and you don't have to be a crackpot conspiracy theorist to think so. Things often don't follow the rules of reality in the nightmare realms, in so much as there are rules of reality in Bloodborne. The Hunter's Nightmare is a massive distortion of the waking world version of Yharnam, and the references to Laurence within the nightmare don't align with what we know about Laurence from the waking world. We know that Laurence's cleric beast body doesn't look remotely similar to his actual beastly remains from the Grand Cathedral. Here, Laurence's skull is more rounded and ape-like, whereas the cleric beast skull is much more elongated, like a hybrid of a wolf and a deer. More importantly, Laurence's actual beastly skull shows that he was much more human in appearance, even possessing long, straight hair, which we don't observe in the cleric beast version of Laurence. He still had many smooth, human-like teeth, not like the pointed incisors and canines we see within the mouth of the cleric beast. Assuming Brador killed or dissected Laurence, the cleric beast form we see in the Nightmare Cathedral and the cleric beast flesh we see in Brador's attire must be distortions, embellishments, or red herrings, because they simply don't match the waking world version of Laurence. But why? It gets back to the point that the altars are telling us two stories, one that could be interpreted literally, and one that could be interpreted metaphorically. I've mentioned repeatedly in my analyses that Bloodborne's central medical metaphor treats hunters as parallels to Victorian surgeons and anatomists, while beasts are treated as surgical patients and, much more commonly, cadavers. As I demonstrated throughout my Agony of Effort series and in the previous video about Laurence, the imprint of anatomical dissection can be found everywhere in this game. To name a few, Kaz and Yharnam were dissected, their unborn children removed. Lady Maria tells us that a corpse should be left well alone, a warning against dissecting dead bodies. We find strange weapons throughout the Hunter's Nightmare, which are carbon copies of the cemetery guns used in Victorian Europe and the United States to protect graves from body snatchers who would sell the bodies of the recently deceased to surgeons for dissection. The butcher set in Japanese is called the dissection set and equates hunters with anatomists and beasts with cadavers. The name of the executioner enemies in Japanese means body disassembler or dissector. The so-called tomb prospectors of the church go digging through graves for special body parts. The examples go on and on and on. Even the church hunters likely are direct references to body snatchers. In Bloodborne, the hunt takes place at night, just like when body snatching occurred, always under the cover of darkness. That's why one of the nicknames for body snatchers, especially in the United States, was night doctors. According to American Black history scholar Gladys-Marie Fry, the term night doctor, derived from the fact that victims were sought only at night, applied to both students of medicine who supposedly stole cadavers from which to learn about body processes, and professional thieves who sold bodies, living and dead, to physicians for medical research. Author and folklorist Mark Lasky noted that night doctors lurked the streets around medical schools, hospitals, poorhouses, and train stations in search of victims to kidnap for research purposes. Certainly that sounds much like the kidnapper enemies lurking outside of Uden Chapel, but it perfectly captures the black and white church hunters, doctors who roam the streets of Yharnam during the night of the hunt looking for the sick whose bodies might be used for experimentation. Why focus again on these references to anatomical dissection and the equating of beasts with cadavers? Well, let's think about it. What do we see on the so-called Surgery Altar? As I mentioned before, we see three figures wearing surgical long gloves manipulating a dead body. But we also see a beast lurking below the surgical table, as if to signal that within the body of men lies a beast. Almost as if it's to be taken literally, that by dissecting a man's body, we unleash an inner beast or render the dead person a beast. That's what the metaphor seems to have been telling us all along, that beasthood is something found inside men. The beast roar says terrible things lurk deep within the frames of men. The clawmark rune describes beasthood as a horrific and unwelcome instinct deep within the hearts of men. The beast claw says that the beast within awakens as flesh is flayed and blood is sprayed. It's as though within man, as in literally inside him, lies a beast. Hunters, who are analogs for anatomists and surgeons, no longer see humans as people. They only see them as beasts to be carved up. Jura counsels us to avoid this mindset, saying, in case you fail to realize, the things you hunt, they're not beasts, they're people. So while we could take the most literal path and assume that Brador killed and skinned Laurence after he transformed into a cleric beast, to do so is to ignore the mountains of symbolism and subtext here that are screaming to us that Brador somehow dissected Laurence's dead body. My belief is that the cleric beast imagery related to Laurence and Brador is purely symbolic, although it keeps in line with the dissection metaphor of the game that we've seen in dozens of other places. The Surgery Altar is showing us the closest version of reality regarding what happened to Laurence. This obviously raises many questions. If Laurence was dissected, why? What purpose did that serve? What implications does it have for the character and his impact on the rest of the story? And most obviously, if Laurence's beastly skull is in the Grand Cathedral, how did he become a beast? Before we can address these questions, we need to first go back through a very contentious and largely misunderstood portion of the previous Laurence video. Most of the disagreement involving the video, what really happened to Laurence, stemmed from the discussion of the so-called holy medium of the healing church. We learn about this term from Alfred when we encounter him in Cathedral Ward, where he gives us a brief history of the scholarly institutions in and around Yharnam. When we ask him about the College of Byrgenwerth, Alfred tells us, once a group of young Byrgenwerth scholars discovered a holy medium deep within the tomb, meaning the Tomb of the Gods or the Chalice Dungeons. Alfred then goes on to say that the discovery of this holy medium led to the founding of the healing church and the establishment of blood healing. What exactly is this holy medium? A lot of people want to say it's the old blood, case closed. But it's much more complicated than that. Because it's never openly stated what the holy medium actually is, it's helpful to look at the original Japanese text of Alfred's dialogue. Citing the translation work of Arukia Mania and Last Protagonist, I noted in my previous Laurence video that while the English version of the game uses this term holy medium to describe whatever it was that the Byrgenwerth scholars discovered in and retrieved from the Tomb of the Gods, the original Japanese uses the term seitai, which can be interpreted in a couple of ways. The most common translation of seitai is Eucharist, meaning the bread and wine consumed by Christians during the ceremony of communion. Catholics in particular believe that once consecrated, this bread and wine are the actual body and blood of Christ. That's interesting given that the term setai can also mean simply holy body, which is used when referring to the physical body or corpse of Christ. This translation opens up the possibility that the Bergenworth scholars didn't just bring back some divine substance, they went digging through a place called a tomb and brought back a dead body. This also keeps in line with the extensive theme of body snatching and anatomical dissection that's central to Bloodborne's inspiration and design. While we're in Cathedral Ward, we're also able to ask Alfred about the healing church. As part of his response, he again refers to the holy medium, saying, "I have heard that the holy medium of blood healing is venerated in the main cathedral." Last Protagonist retranslates this line as, "For blood ministration, I've heard the holy body it originates from is enshrined within the Grand Cathedral." Similarly, Arukia Mania retranslates the line as, "I have heard that the holy body, source of the salvation of blood, is enshrined in the Grand Cathedral." These translations much more strongly indicate that there was a bodily origin source of blood ministration that's enshrined or venerated in the Grand Cathedral. When we go to the main cathedral, what do we find that's venerated, meaning revered or deified? What is Vicar Amelia praying to? She's kneeling at an altar containing the bodily remains of Laurence. Alfred's two pieces of dialogue are suggesting that a holy body led to the founding of the healing church and the establishment of blood healing. That's why I argued that it was the retrieval of Laurence's body from the tomb and his subsequent dissection that led to the founding of the healing church and its widespread practice of blood ministration. That's exactly what I think we're observing within the Surgery Altar Cathedral in the Nightmare. This is Laurence's recently deceased body, wrapped in a death shroud. He was buried in a tomb, but something occurred that triggered people to dig up his body and dissect it. Something associated with this process led to the founding of the healing church as we know it and its practice of blood ministration. This is the holy body, also known as the holy medium. Many people were incredulous at this assertion. But when it comes to the idea of Laurence being the holy body upon which the healing church was founded, this isn't just some wild theory of mine. Listen to the words of Bloodborne's creator and director Hidetaka Miyazaki. In 2016, Miyazaki did an interview about Bloodborne with Future Press, which covered various facets of the game. The interviewer turned to the topic of the famous Fear the Old Blood cutscene featuring Willem and Laurence, saying to Miyazaki, "The scene after you defeat Amelia also leaves a lot to the imagination." Miyazaki responded, "That's meant to give you a look into the memory of Laurence, who appears in the cutscene as well. His skull served as the start of the healing church itself, but it's taken the form of a twisted beast. There's a lot you can imagine from that." Miyazaki says here that Laurence's skull served as the start of the healing church. Alfred tells us that the holy body venerated in the Grand Cathedral led to the founding of the healing church and the establishment of blood healing. It seems pretty obvious that they're saying the same thing. Laurence's body, removed from the grave and dissected, somehow, some way, was the catalyst for the creation of the healing church and its practice of blood ministration. This is why I argued in the previous video that Laurence got his name from Laurence Sterne, an 18th century English vicar turned writer whose dead body was removed from the grave and dissected. His cranium was sawn off, and the skull was likely kept on display at Cambridge. Understandably, there are some massive questions about what happened between Laurence's departure from Bergenworth and the rise of the healing church. That's especially true given that one of the most widespread and deeply held beliefs in the lore community is that Laurence left Bergenworth with the specific intent to establish the healing church. How could he establish the church if his skull was what started it? And what does a skull have to do with the establishment of blood ministration? If the scene from the surgery altar is in fact a representation of the dissection of Laurence's body, then it's possible that whatever was discovered inside his dissected skull, as Miyazaki indicated, was what served as the start of the healing church. What was discovered in Lawrence's skull? The likeliest explanation is some kind of mystical blood. It's the so-called old blood. And that's where we'll continue next time. Thanks for watching.